A famous explorer once said that the extraordinary is in what we do, not who we are. I'd finally set out to make my mark, to find adventure. But instead, adventure found me.
Hi, and welcome to the third episode in my Video Games and Geography series. In this episode, we will extend upon two arguments that I have already made before. First, that video game design relies on mechanics of exploration and domination of the landscape. Secondly, that video games act as a representation of cultural values. Building on these two findings, we will, in this episode, investigate imperialist tropes through a post-colonial perspective. But first, in order to continue, we need to establish a bit of a theoretical background. So the term post-colonial is, in my opinion, actually somewhat poorly named because it implies a temporal shift from a colonial era to one of independence. But in actuality, a post-colonial perspective focuses on colonial traces that still linger, despite the official political era of decolonization. In this sense, we can think about power structures, stereotypical imaginations, and cartographic practices. Now, there's actually quite a bit of research out there regarding studying video games through a post-colonial lens. Mukherjee and Hammer, for example, define post-colonialism as a critical view addressing key issues related to the identity and the subjectivity of colonized and formerly colonized peoples, and to their spatial and temporal perceptions. In another article on video games and post-colonialism, Mukherjee defines the latter more broadly, as addressing all aspects of the colonial process from the beginning of colonial contact. This episode is going to be split up into three different parts. First, we are going to look at archaeological action-adventure games and analyze how video games define the imperialist imagination of the Orient. Secondly, we will look at strategy games in which colonial cartographic practices will be highlighted. And in the third and final part, argue that video games can act as a catalyzer of debate or discussion about societal issues such as racism and discrimination. In the first episode, I referred to the Journal of Media Geography to highlight landscape representation in video games. Now, in a different chapter from the same journal, Claudia Breger analyzes the Tomb Raider games and investigates how the games relate to modern imperialism and stereotypical imaginations of the Orient. In Tomb Raider, you play as Lara Croft, who's a British aristocrat that travels to exotic places in order to uncover valuable artifacts and treasure. The player must overcome the obstacles these harsh environments present, for example, jungles or ancient temples. In order to realize these exotic landscapes, the game design is ripe with stereotypical imaginations of such exotic locations. Claudia Breger points out that the medium of video game is essential here, because the spatial navigation in video games is reminiscent of the 19th century explorer. Through the eyes of Lara, we are presented with a harsh, unforgiving environment that must be traversed and explored. Because it is a video game for the player to experience, these landscapes only exist to serve Lara's adventure. The jungle, the ancient tomb, or the wrecked ship, they are present in the game for the player only to conquer them through Lara. In this sense, the player shares the same goal with the imperialist explorer. The player progresses through the game through exploration and domination of the game's levels, while the 19th century European explorer advances his career by mapping new territories. In fact, we can see through history that this exploration is often shown as a hallmark of scientific progress. The invention of ships and the ability to travel and explore faraway lands are often seen as Europe's embodiment of historical progress. The European explorers and sailors in this context are active and dynamic, while the exotic destinations along which their population is passive. There is no progress there, they only exist to welcome and serve these explorers. This is reminiscent of the design of Tomb Raider, in which Lara is the active agent, enacting her agency upon the landscape that exists only to further her narrative. So in order to bring an example of this archaeological fantasy to the table that is a bit more on the nose, I would like to briefly showcase the game Forewarned. Forewarned's design takes tomb raiding to a very literal level. You play as an explorer that raids the tomb of ancient mummies, claiming valuable artifacts and treasure, after which the game will reward you with money that lets you buy better equipment. The artifacts retrieved, or stolen, from the tomb are also displayed in your office after the mission is completed. The game plays off very powerful imaginations of the Orient as dangerous and exotic and to be uncovered and conquered. These imaginations unfold in four different ways. Firstly, the landscape that the player navigates is fantastically stereotypical through and through. The tombs are littered with traps, reanimated mummies that try to kill the player, a giant snake, and evil guard spirits. In true Indiana Jones fashion, there are even boulders that will try to crush the player. In the first stage of the game, the player must overcome these obstacles and map out the tomb. This is what I call the stage of exploration. First, what is unknown must be uncovered. The second stage is domination. After the tomb is explored, the player must open the main burial chamber. This will reveal the main artifact that the player must retrieve, but it will also release the spirit of the mummy that is buried there, who will now be enraged because the player has stolen his artifact. If the player manages to return from the tomb with all their limbs still attached, they will return to the office with the artifact displayed in the glass cage and be rewarded with a nice amount of money. And this is basically all there is to the game. There is no greater narrative, no greater story, no moral ambiguity of the player. Questions such as, who did these artifacts rightly belong to, or is it morally acceptable to break into an ancient tomb, are left out of the game. So let's talk about strategy games. Strategy games are interesting for geographers because they are played on a traditional map. Shoshana Magnet wrote an article on how the maps of Tropico contain ideologies and enact power. Now, Tropico is a strategy game in which the player assumes the role of a dictator ruling an island, but I argue that the theories that Shoshana Magnet brings to the fore apply to almost all strategy games, since they revolve around the same concept and use maps in the same way. Magnet makes three claims that are of special importance here. First, power relations are organized spatially. Secondly, there is a relation between power and vision. Thirdly, maps neutralize or hide inequalities. In order to highlight these three claims with an example, I will use Total War Shogun 2, which is shown on screen. In this game, the player assumes control of a Japanese clan during a power struggle for the shogunate, the control over all of Japan. The player must build up armies, engage in trade and diplomacy, develop their towns, and fight battles. I chose Shogun 2 because I'm personally very familiar with the game, but ultimately it doesn't really matter, because these three concepts I am presenting are present in the majority of strategy games. Let's start by looking at the perspective of the player. The main landscape the game takes place in is on top of a map of Japan. This map shows your own clan and your neighbors. The unexplored territories are hidden by what in video game terminology is called the fog of war. The player must send an army or fleet to uncover these lands. On the map, the player is disembodied. This immediately makes the experience of strategy games different from games you've seen before in this series. We are not controlling a physical body like Lara Croft, but rather we are hovering over Japan, looking down on it. Shoshana Magnet refers to this as the godlike view, as we are literally looking down on the landscape and carrying out our commands, making things happen. Not only do we as players have this godlike vision by looking down on the map, we also have temporal authority. What I mean by this is that nothing happens unless we make it happen. I can walk away from my computer and leave the game running for an hour and nothing in the game will change. This is a popular format in strategy games and it's called turn-based strategy. These two aspects are reminiscent of the usage of maps in colonial times, as just like the player, the European imperialists would stand over a map and act out commands. The map, in this sense, grants complete authority and vision. This vision, however, is zoomed out in a way. Just as a colonial map of Africa only showed the territorial view, so what belongs to whom, so does the map in Shogun. I can zoom in on my towns and see some movement, but what is actually happening to my citizens is invisible. The game is only concerned with what territory I have already claimed, and which territory I still need to claim in order to become victorious. Citizens of my realm only come to the fore in a cost-benefit consideration. If the population is unhappy, I will run a risk of rebellion. The game lets you deal with this in two ways. Station military troops in the town, which the game terms as repression, or by lowering the taxes. Either way, I must choose. Stationing military troops in a town to keep the population in check costs me money, and so does lowering taxes. Local issues and questions of inequality are completely invisible on the map. They are only made visible when my territory becomes threatened. Now, just for fun, I looked at some old maps from Japan during the time the game takes place, and they look very different from modern maps, as well as the in-game map, and I thought it would be interesting to think about how the game could look or would be played on such a map. It could be interesting to experience a strategy game that could take place on a map that is different from the conventional map.
Resident Evil 5.
In this last section, I will argue how video games can act as a catalyzer for debate on social issues. I came across an article by Brian McKernan who analyzes a social debate erupting after the release of the trailer for Resident Evil 5. For a bit of context, Resident Evil is a Japanese survival horror series made by Capcom, in which the player must survive in a world that has been plagued by some kind of virus, turning populations into some kind of zombie. Most Resident Evil games follow the same formula. The player finds himself in the middle of a zombie pandemic or something similar, and must manage resources along the way in order to survive. At the end, there is some kind of confrontation with the source, like a boss battle, that supposedly then ends the catastrophe. Resident Evil 5 takes place in a fictional African country. In the trailer, black Africans were shown as savage and violent, even before becoming infected with the parasite. While the protagonist, Chris Redfield, guns as many of them down as possible in order to progress through the story. Following the trailer, a massive debate erupted on video game forums. Game critics and a minority of the player base took issue with the way Resident Evil 5 depicts black Africans, and the image of a white muscular man traveling to Africa to gun down said Africans. Brian McKernan, the aforementioned author of the article, sides with the game critics and argues that Africa is shown as run-down, homogeneous, and a debilitated place, supposing Africans are unable to take care of themselves. The majority of the player base rejected the notion that Resident Evil 5 contains racist imagery, and that anyone who views video games through a racial lens chooses to do so. A big argument from this side is also that games are purely entertainment and that real-world politics do not concern it. Now my goal here is not to decide which side is right or whether the game contains racist imagery or not, but rather I want to use this example to take issue with those in academia that still see video games as only entertainment and not having any societal value. The debate started as a Japanese horror game set in Africa, which was then decontextualized and then recontextualized into American society and its history of racial injustice. Such an example, in my opinion, is ample proof that games are much more than just simple entertainment, and social scientists should take them seriously. I also want to add an example I found by complete coincidence as I was making this episode. Sometimes I like to frequent the discussion boards of games that I enjoy playing. I don't actively participate in these discussions, but I kinda lurk around and keep up to date with what the player base is discussing. One such a game is Deep Rock Galactic, in which you play as a team of 4 dwarves that are colonizing a planet and extracting its resources. I came across some threads on the discussion board where players asked if female dwarves would be added as playable characters. In fact, and after a quick search, I found that many of these threads, all on the same topic, already existed. And to my surprise, these threads were met with much resistance or hostility, which quite surprised me, because from my experience playing the game, the player base is very welcoming and friendly. It raised some questions for me, such as, why does the player base desire female dwarves to be added to the game in the first place? But also, why is there so much hostility when this idea is suggested? These kind of discussions held on video game forums could provide interesting material for social scientists who are concerned with debate on social issues. With all these examples in mind, I think it is safe to say that a post-colonial perspective brings a lot to the table when studying video games. Taking a post-colonial perspective further cements the argument that video games do not exist as separate entities, but reflect cultural values. A post-colonial perspective allows us to be critical and ask whether these values are desirable. The medium of video games is especially relevant here because, as we have seen, it integrates colonial tendencies and stereotypical imaginations into video game design. But why are games designed that way? When finding the answer to this question, I think it's important to remember that video games are a commodity, a product. The developers try to design their games in such a way that they're fun to play, so that they can sell as many copies as possible. So the question then becomes, why are games that contain these elements fun to play? This opens up, I believe, larger questions about how these colonial tendencies are integrated into consumer culture, and then we can decide whether they are desirable or not. That marks the end of the third episode on post-colonialism. In the next episode, we will talk about video game tourism, or about how the digital landscape imposes tangible transformations upon the real landscape. See you then.